For many immigrants, America was more than a dream of freedom. It was also the chance to set up a business, and for some of them, to succeed. In the 1960s, the young Australian press entrepreneur Rupert Murdoch did not miss the chance. In 2007, he is the head of the world's second largest media group, News Corporation. His huge New York building houses all the companies that he controls, 800 of them spread throughout the world. His inner sanctum is off limits to the press. In February 2007, along with Daniel Granet, the French specialist in media, we went to meet the most important strategists gathered in New York for the World Media Summit meeting. Of the 20 most powerful groups in the world, 16 are American. Rupert Murdoch, the Citizen Kane of today's world, decided to attend the summit. It was forbidden to ask him a single question.
Good morning, Mr. Murdoch. What do you say to the...
Please step back. Please step back. Excuse me. Please step back. I cannot let you down in the front row.
Yeah.
Okay? I understand. You need to stay here, please.
Concentrated and withdrawn, he gets himself ready to preach the good word.
One of the most astute, forward-thinking, and I dare say youthful executives of the digital era.
The sun never sets on his empire, an empire worth 76 billion euros on the stock exchange. News Corporation is present in more than 50 countries, in the press, publishing, television, cinema, the making of programs, and internet. From Australia to Asia, from Great Britain to continental Europe, from South America to the United States. The owner of News Corporation is welcomed like a star, listened to like a prophet. The first pillar on which he built his press empire is still its basis today.
You know, we're said to have a lot of newspapers. The truth of the matter is, we don't. Vast number of those papers are small and medium-sized suburban weeklies in Australia. We have the major circulation paper, at least in every state capital. There are about 5 papers in Australia, and we have the Post here, we have the Times and the Sun in London, which are very major papers and major businesses.
At this summit meeting, John Fine observes the emperor's success. Fine, who works for an American business weekly, is the world's leading media analyst.
Rupert Murdoch is at heart a newspaper man. He knows how to sell a newspaper. He knows how to sell a tabloid newspaper. You have a headline, you grab people, you know, very visceral. A lot of people don't understand that. He understands it very well. He has consistently sort of transmuted that into every different medium he goes into. News, Fox News Channel, boom, no question. Even, you know, with television, with everything, I mean, he understands how to appeal to the consumer in a kind of very visceral way that I think a lot of people don't understand. And he's comfortable with, you know, he doesn't have to pretend he's the New York Times. He's comfortable admitting his is a popular style. It might be harsh to say, you know, the New York Times failed, or, you know, like the Times, well, the Times of that the Telegraph of London failed, or, you know, Le Monde failed. He's found a path to be enormously successful. He's done things in a different way. He's done things on a global scale. And he, in a way, he has set up his company that he is truly the architect of it in ways that you don't really see anymore. And he has been more successful with that than pretty much anyone in this space right now.
I've been on the wars we fight, griping about the way things ought to be.
Rupert Murdoch was born in Australia, the country of vast open spaces inhabited by cowboys since the beginnings.
When they're running
Murdoch still likes the contact with these rough fellows who so greatly influenced his youth. The whole Australian story of the Murdoch family began in 1884. His great-grandfather and his grandfather were Protestant preachers, and their families left Scotland and came to this still virgin continent to preach the good word. But religious tradition stopped there. Keith Murdoch, their son and grandson respectively, was destined for journalism. In 1914, Keith was appointed war correspondent. He became famous covering the bloody Battle of the Dardanelles. He met one of the great British press barons, Lord Northcliffe, who trained him to run newspapers. Keith Murdoch bought a local daily in his country. He chose journalism for his son Rupert and sent him to Worcester College, Oxford. Rupert Murdoch was a mediocre student. When his father died suddenly, Rupert Murdoch, at 22, found himself the owner of the family property, Cruden Farm, and of his father's daily newspaper, an inheritance burdened with debts. Without any complexes, he entered the market and launched himself into a world that was controlled by a handful of big newspaper proprietors. His character and his abilities came to light. He was headstrong, impetuous, shrewd, cynical, a gambler. Young Murdoch had an intuition about the future of the press. He also had the cool-headedness to pull off his business deals. His first big deal was the creation of the daily that became a national reference, The Australian. In 14 years, the foundations of his empire had been laid. Success was staring him in the face. He remarried in 1967. Anna Torrey was a young Australian journalist. Murdoch decided to conquer Great Britain, the land of his ancestors. The British press was in the hands of the Lords. They were trying to get rid of the newspapers that were losing them money. Murdoch bought 2 tabloids in quick succession, The News of the World and The Sun. A few years later, The Times, one of the pearls of the British press, went on the market. For almost 2 centuries, The Times had been the newspaper of the establishment, the voice of the British ex-empire. Licking his chops, Murdoch bought the prestigious daily for 45 million euros. Our correspondent Isabella Thomas will accompany us throughout our investigation in London, an investigation that will prove complex in the land of democracy. Thanks to Isabella, we meet Emma Duncan, the very high-profile editor of the liberal business weekly, The Economist.
In the mid-1980s, the print unions were so fabulously powerful that it was virtually impossible to make money in newspapers in Britain. He crushed the British print unions. It was him who did it. There was a strike, 86, 87. It was violent, it was vicious. It turned most of the country's left-wing intelligentsia against him. But the consequence of that was very beneficial for the British newspaper market because with the unions so much less powerful, production costs fell, and it made it possible, for instance, for the Independent to flourish, which would have had a very hard time in the previous union-dominated situation. So I think that for British newspaper readers, he's been a great deal more beneficial than most Brits would permit.
Since their beginnings, British newspapers have been printed in Fleet Street, the historic center of the press in London. Rupert Murdoch plays a double game. On the one hand, he leads the unions to believe that he is still producing his newspapers in Fleet Street, which is now abandoned. On the other hand, behind the backs of the unions and the majority of the journalists, he imported from the United States new digital presses unknown in Great Britain. The machines were unloaded on the docks of Wapping, right near Tower Bridge, and then installed in old warehouses. The workers in the printing trade felt betrayed. Negotiations between the unions and Murdoch were broken off. The workers besieged Wapping. They tried to block the new presses that were in operation. The battle would last for 2 years. At the same time, Rupert Murdoch brought in technicians from the United States. They had all been trained there in the new technologies. For the thousands of union workers, the change meant death. During the more and more violent strike, the 4 newspapers of the Murdoch Group appeared every day. Margaret Thatcher supported Rupert Murdoch in his fight. She had already broken the miners' union. The printing trade unions lost the battle. Murdoch had won his second poker game.
Murdoch was somebody who just loved going into a market and taking on the vested interest, shaking it up, just walking into rooms where all these smug people would think, who is this newcomer? What does he think he can do here? And 3 years later, they wouldn't know what had hit them. And so he and Mrs. Thatcher, in some ways, approached Britain in the same way, wanted the same things for it. And so those two characters knit perfectly together in the 80s. Margaret Thatcher took the Conservative Party and changed it somewhat. I mean, she was very hostile to the Britain that is very comfortable with itself and sits there and very happy with the existing hierarchy and doesn't want change. And she shook up Britain. She wanted to shake up the vested interests in Britain to enable more growth.
20 years later, the strikes have been forgotten. Today, the tabloids, The Sun and the News of the World, as well as the more classic daily newspapers, The Times and the Sunday Times, are all located at the Wapping Press Center. In spite of our numerous requests, it was impossible to interview the editors of the different papers or to film the most modern presses in the world. It was an out-of-bounds business center, a highly strategic place. It is protected by barriers topped with barbed wire. Isabella Thomas, our correspondent, doesn't understand these restrictions.
So I must say I'm surprised that it's been so difficult to get access, not just to interview the editors of The Times or The Sun or the News of the World, but even to get access into the building or into the print places in Wapping or Enfield. I think it speaks of extreme caution about any sort of publicity about the Murdoch machine. And I'm not quite sure what the policy is or why that is, but certainly they seem to be fighting shy of any analysis of what they're really up to.
Why journalists who don't belong to the Murdoch group don't want to speak?
Perhaps this is because they may or may not one day work for a Murdoch newspaper. It controls quite a lot of the press after all. They have to think about their future as well as their present. Perhaps they just feel, what's in it for me? They're trying to weigh up the odds about what's in it for them to go on record as being a big critic of Murdoch.
Strange that in this center of democracy, restrictions have become dogma. "60 kilometers from London, in Oxford, the town where Rupert Murdoch studied, lived Stephen Glover, one of his most virulent critics. Glover was a journalist on the Sunday Times when Murdoch bought the paper. Stephen Glover didn't appreciate his new boss's methods. He quit, and in 1986, with 2 colleagues, founded the center-left paper, The Independent.
he was born in Australia. He was educated at Oxford. But he always had a distrust of the British establishment. He's never wanted to become part of it in the way that other rich Australians who've come to live in this country have. He's never wanted a title. He's never wanted a country house. He's never wanted to mix very much with the great and the good, the elite, if you like, of the political and literary and intellectual worlds. He's not particularly interested in that. He's made no secret of the fact that he despises the royal family and he's a Republican. So he's kept outside. And I think he had a lot of, he's drawn a lot of pleasure from the fact that in buying the Times, he acquired the paper of the British establishment and he changed it. Murdoch has influenced the British press and influenced a lot of journalists because he owns, if you add all the circulation of all British newspapers together, he accounts, or national newspapers, he accounts for about 35% of all newspaper circulation. So clearly he's very powerful. And his philosophy really is that people should be entertained. He has no strong idea that people should be educated or improved. They may need to be informed, but above all, they need to be entertained. That is the philosophy. Give the people what they want.
They want the news. They want to be able to trust it. And they want something to think about. And sometimes they, frankly, just want to be entertained. Well, there's nothing wrong with talking to the masses. You know, William Shakespeare wrote for the masses. I think if he was writing today, he'd probably be the chief scriptwriter on All in the Family or Dallas, except he'd be a little bawdier.
In a restaurant in the centre of London, Roy Greenslade agrees to speak to us. The former Sunday Times journalist no longer works for the Murdoch Group. He has become a media historian.
Philosophical belief is that the market is the purest form of democracy. And therefore, it makes sense, if you believe that, to give the readers and the viewers what they want. You say, look, I'm not going to impose ethical standards on my journalists. I'm not going to have ethical standards. They will be set by the readers and viewers and listeners. And if they are happy to buy what I offer, then they'll take it. If I try this, I have women without clothes on and they don't want it, I won't give it to them. But if they do want it, I will. If they want a paper that's full of humour and full of triviality, and I find there's a market for it, I'll give it to them. Of course, he's accused of lowering standards because of that, but it fits in neatly with his view that it's simply people dictating taste, not he playing the tastemaker. The world moves by trade and business, and Rupert Murdoch does. There is great logic to his political views as well. His politics are tied closely to what works in terms of the market. So it's a relationship between politics and economics that is consistent as far as he's concerned.
As in Great Britain, deregulation in the United States worked in Rupert Murdoch's favor. At the same time that he bought his English papers, he went on a buying spree in the United States. He took over the New York Post for about $30 million. Action! In Hollywood, he acquired the prestigious film studio 20th Century Fox, owner of 4 television channels. An investment of $1,085 million. His debt is multiplied by 6. With his wife and 3 children, he moves to the fashionable district of Central Park. In the US, to own a TV channel, you must have American citizenship. Murdoch took out citizenship without a qualm. He went back and forth constantly between New York and London. Wherever there was a medium for sale, he was there. In 1989, he carries off 38% of the British television satellite distribution system, B-Sky B. which was constantly losing money. That year, he took his third huge gamble, an enormous risk. Olivier Girolami knew Rupert Murdoch well. He had been involved in the long negotiations for the sale of the Italian subsidiary of Canal+ to the News Corporation Group. Girolami had been Director General of this subsidiary company.
I've met him personally a few times. We've had lunch together a few times, just him and me, more or less. And the memory I have of him is the difference between the reputation he has and the man he is. The first time, before I'd ever met him, I was terrified by the idea of meeting a great media mogul, someone who was extremely daunting and who had the reputation of being a shark, of being arrogant, etc. And I found myself in the presence of someone who, on a personal level, is extremely kind, who listens, who is very approachable. Murdoch, or rather News Corp Great Britain, is a great power. It's clearly the leading world group in Great Britain, not only in newspapers, but also, of course, in television with the unrivaled platform B-Sky B. So if you want to schematize the English television setup, you have on the one hand pay TV, which represents 40% of market penetration. More than 10 million households subscribe to some pay TV channel, and of those 10 million, more than 80% are with B-Sky B. So you have a pay TV operator who is completely dominant, incredibly powerful, who has more subscribers than any other pay TV operator in Europe, the highest turnover, more channels and services offered to consumers, and obviously the biggest profit and financial clout. And you can obviously add to that the activities in Great Britain of Fox, who are very strongly established, both in films, in cinemas, in the DVD market, and in home video, and in the emerging market of VOD, and the sale of goods on broadband networks. So Murdoch is, without question, the most powerful, the richest, the most diversified player in the audiovisual field in Great Britain, who can afford to buy practically 20% of ATV, the equivalent of TF1, in 24 hours on the stock market, just because he doesn't want to let his rivals get their hands on it. He's completely hooked on the business. He's an addict, workaholic, as they say here, the guy who works all the time, who wants to know everything that's going on. He manages his empire by phone with no problem, quite oblivious of time differences, night, day, etc. And he's someone, I'm quite sure, who'll never let up. He'll go on working till his last breath.
What's this about? Oh, no. Oh, Peter. It's about the Ripper. Nobody wants to read about the Ripper. You told me you find it irresistible. No, I didn't. I did the Ripper, it's a turner.
He was never satisfied. His assets had quadrupled, his profits doubled. He seemed invincible, but his debt was still multiplied by 4. At the end of 1990, Rupert Murdoch was on the point of losing everything. The Wall Street stock market in New York, as well as all of the world's stock markets, was crumbling. The Gulf War brought about brutal recession and a sudden drop in advertising. On the brink of bankruptcy, Rupert Murdoch had to beg the banks to renegotiate his debt. Murdoch owed almost $3 billion to 146 banks. He succeeded in seducing the bankers, promising to undertake a financial restructuring of his empire. To strengthen his group, he solicited the backing of the rich Saudi Arabian prince Al-Walid, whom he brought into the company. Al-Walid had been introduced to him by one of his business relations, Tarek Ben Ammar, the Franco-Tunisian cinema and television producer.
He was nominally left-wing, and he famously had a little bust, a little statue of Lenin in his room at Worcester College, Oxford. I think you might say that some of Lenin's less democratic tendencies could possibly have appealed to Rupert Murdoch. So possibly even then he was a curious man of the left, if you like. As time went on, he moved to the right, although he regularly has supported nominally left-of-centre governments, both in Australia and this country. I mean, he's been Tony Blair's greatest supporter. What Murdoch really wants above all are the commercial conditions in which he can make the maximum amount of money. He's a capitalist above all. He will get into bed with anybody, as he has in China, which is supposed to be a communist regime. He will get into bed with anybody in order to make money. That is his driving force. He always puts that before ideology and can support this government or that government according to where his commercial interests lie.
Asia is a new field of conquest. In China, he invested in Star TV, the largest conglomerate of TV cable and satellite channels. Then he invested in Phoenix TV, another Chinese channel. In India, he linked up with the Indian group Tata to launch Zee TV. His objective was to get ahead of his competitors. He even bought local production companies that made popular series. They were destined for the Star channels. They broadcast in Thailand, in the Philippines, and even in Malaysia, in Indonesian Muslim countries rebellious to the West. He became the largest foreign operator in Asia. A large part of the development of the News Corporation empire was financed, for 20 years, through the dividends of the second Australian airline, Ansett, of which Murdoch was one of the main shareholders. Ansett also owned the television network 10, the jewel he coveted. In 2000, he sold his shares. A year later, Ansett went bankrupt. The power of his group is never strong enough. His objective is clearer than ever: develop or die. Fox News, the non-stop American television channel, is his biggest success. The president of Fox came up with the formula: more girls, more tits, more trash. In 10 years, Fox is up there with all the big ones, even overtaking its rival, CNN. His credo: to support the Republican Party, in particular the neoconservatists who pushed George W. Bush into invading Iraq.
Were weak and of little national security consequence. Analyzing the same raw intelligence as the CIA, Feith came to different conclusions.
200 miles from New York, Woodstock, Bob Dylan's town, is refuge to many writers and artists. Jeff Cohen moved there with his family 15 years ago. Cohen is the media critic who founded FAIR, whose aim is to decipher daily the information diffused by the major media.
I was the leader of a media watch group called FAIR, and Fox News started, and they used to invite us all the time because they couldn't get other guests, especially guests who were not in ideological agreement with their enterprise. So they would call and they would call and they would call, and finally we started saying yes, mostly because we were curious of what was Roger Ailes, the chairman of Fox News, what was he doing with Rupert Murdoch's money?
Big night.
The dream that we had is coming true.
And one of these divas' big moment. Which one is going to sing with JT? It's your hookup to Hollywood. This is E! News.
News in America is almost completely entertainment. It's not about informing a citizenry so they could decide how to run their society. That's not what it's about. The viewers aren't treated as citizens, they're treated as spectators. And the news is turned into entertainment. So whatever the hottest story is that they can grab, they turn it into a soap opera. So they hope that everyone in America will learn the characters. And once they learn the characters, they get absorbed in the drama. And they want to watch it every hour, not just every day, but every hour. So right now we're in the middle of a soap opera involving Anna Nicole Smith.
Knows where the granddaughter is. No one knows where Danny Lynn is except Howard K. Stern.
Anna Nicole Smith, who often featured on the cover of Playboy, is today again headline news on Fox News Current Affairs. She has just died of an overdose at the age of 39. She got married at the age of 26 to an 89-year-old Texan oil millionaire. Widowed 1 year later, she continued to be in the news, leading a tumultuous lifestyle. She leaves behind her millions of dollars, a baby, and 3 putative fathers.
You have, once this happened that she died, it was treated as a world historical story. It was like Nelson Mandela getting out of prison, but bigger. And you'd have hour after hour of people without any news or any information analyzing why she might have died, who might be the father of her child, who's going to get the money, is the little baby that she's left behind going to get the money. And hour after hour they brought on lawyers and doctors and medical examiners to speculate. And it's the dominant story in our country for days, and I assume it will go on for weeks and weeks. Fox is the standard for cable news, and has had much impact on what we call broadcast TV news, the big 3, CBS, NBC, and ABC. And it has had impact on just the graphics and pace. I mean, TV news in America was always pretty mindless compared to European television. But it got even faster and stupider and glitzier. Fox News this is how it's different than, say, I think it's very effective propaganda, and in that way it's very different than, say, Soviet television, because Soviet television is not effective, never was. People would watch it, but the majority of people knew that there were no debates, no dissent, and it's just propaganda. The improvement that Fox News has made in the field of propaganda is they purport to have debates all day long, but the debates are always weighted to the right wing. Yeah, do you understand they're running here senior editor. These are all editors of one right-wing magazine. That's your spectrum of views. And they're having like an animated, they're getting angry with each other. It's this facade of a debate when it's not real. See, this is the essence of American television. It's pharmaceutical ads, how to make yourself more beautiful, especially aimed at women. And the 22 minutes of news is really secondary to the 8 minutes every half hour of commercials. And if you can dumb down the audience, then these commercials, these manipulative commercials, become more successful in their goals.
Times Square in New York is one of the largest open-air publicity spaces in the world. Advertising and stock market quotations go hand in glove, symbols of the consumer and information society. Every day, the technological revolution increases the financial economy, the virtual capitalism of the world. Fox News is omnipresent. At the age of 68, Murdoch got married for the 3rd time to Wendy Ding, a 30-year-old Chinese journalist interpreter whom he had met in Hong Kong. Rupert Murdoch, who was ordinarily so retiring, invited all New York, as well as the great names from Hollywood, and all his courtesans on board his yacht, the Morning Glory. He was already father to 4 children by his previous spouses, but he and his new wife would soon have 2 little girls. He appointed his new wife vice president of News Corporation in Asia. Up until then, Rupert Murdoch had always been in charge. In February 2007, he was challenged for the first time by the millionaire founder of Virgin, Richard Branson. Murdoch had passed him an 18% participation in the British television network ITV in 2006. Branson forced Tony Blair's government to decide.
Any businessman has a duty to his shareholders to try to dominate, to build up a company that is a dominant force. But any government has to make sure that they do that within the competition rules. Personally, I think Murdoch has gone one step too far. But I think he went many steps too far a long time ago. He's now got...
Not only did these attacks not worry him, but he went one further, making a bid for the Wall Street Journal, a top American economic and financial paper. He challenged the press establishment and began a head-to-head struggle with the family of the owner, the Bancrofts. All his strategies were supported by the bankers, who were fascinated by his success. Murdoch knows how to bring together traditional and new media. He wrongfoots his rivals and upsets the markets. In July 2006, News Corporation bought the American site MySpace.com that groups together more than 100 million internet users. It's the most visited social networking website in the world.
C'est la première et pour le moment la seule société de médias.
It's the first, the only traditional media company, TV press, radio, etc., that has made major investments in the world of the web, with MySpace, which was the first movement by a Hollywood major of a traditional medium using something very much directed towards what we call user-generated content, the peer-to-peer, things that are relatively distant from those professions, and that was a groundbreaker. He's the oldest of all the CEOs of the great international media groups, and he was the first to beat everyone else to it by investing massively in the web.
MySpace is probably profitable right now. I think MySpace can make an enormous amount of money. I may not think it's going to be the biggest asset on the internet, but look, I mean, you can basically do the math on this. Rupert Murdoch spent, today he said, a total of $650 million to buy the parent company of MySpace. At the end of last year, he signed a deal with Google that will get him guarantees more or less of approximately $900 million for advertising on MySpace. That's just through Google alone. I mean, boom, done, game over, he made money. They will make money.
From his house in Woodstock, Jeff Cohen, like a lot of intellectuals, has Rupert Murdoch and Fox News in his line of fire. 8 hours a day, he sends his analyses on the media to his internet networks all over the world.
He can put his advertising in there. He can start...
The business.
Yeah, he can start all around it, I think, maybe. He has in mind that he will continually put his Fox News, his pseudo news, his phony news, and maybe people that don't know any better, if that's the thing they see, you know, if they want the latest on some sex scandal, they'll go there. Maybe he's got those designs because millions of people go to MySpace. And maybe he believes that the phone companies and the cable companies will transform the internet so that it's just the commercial speech that gets in the fast lane that everyone will have access to. And the citizen information, which has been so detrimental to the whole Murdoch enterprise, that that'll be in a slow lane without wide accessibility to the mass of people. Maybe he knows something I don't, but I suspect he's speaking how he wishes it were be.
John and his friends believe in the ethic put forward by Joseph Pulitzer, the founder of the School of Journalism of Columbia University in New York. Our republic and its press will rise or perish together.
The question over whether anyone can be a journalist, and I think he had a good point, which is that there's space for technology to help journalists out and to help people help journalism by becoming kind of improvised field reporters and using cell phones to take pictures of things happen on the field. But essentially you need trained professional journalists to be able to make sense of the information and be able to put the information together in a compelling narrative and being able to report the story adequately. As far as the idea of objectivity, it is sort of the religion to which American journalists aspire, but in Columbia they stress that objectivity isn't something that journalists can reasonably aspire to, and that fairness is something that's more accurate and maybe incorporates the inevitable limitations of one's own perspective, in the sense that humans are always going to have subjective interpretations of events, and that they should just strive to weigh the evidence and be fair rather than being objective, which is essentially impossible. Young journalists are aware of the conflict between corporations' need to be profitable and to make money, and also their need to provide a public service. And sometimes those two things can be in conflict with one another. Most people at this school probably would feel that Fox News is much more interested in kind of their bottom line of telling audiences what they want to hear, rather than rigorously reporting the truth about America's direction, for example.
The students go from one surprise to another. Even within the Murdoch press, growth is weak. To make up for this backward step, Murdoch decides to compete against himself. He launches a free daily, the London Paper, distributed at the entrances of London tube stations.
Free paper? Free London paper? Paper? Yeah, the last one. Free paper?
The other surprise is his methods. The Murdoch Group hires a private detective for the news of the world so they can spy on the cell phones of Prince William and other celebrities. After an investigation into articles that were published about the private life of Prince William, there was a sensational trial. The editor-in-chief resigned. The detective and the reporter were sentenced to 6 and 4 months in jail. With this slap in the face for journalism, Murdoch's media started to put pressure on those in power.
Murdoch himself is not yet saying. He's enjoying playing with these politicians like a cat with a mouse. Indeed, an Australian journalist described to me once how he was at a meeting with Murdoch and John Howard, who later became the right-wing Prime Minister of Australia, and Rupert Murdoch. And Rupert Murdoch went off into a room with John Howard, and they talked together for half an hour, and then John Howard came out, and he was crying. And the journalist, the Australian journalist, who's a very leading Australian journalist, told me that what had happened was that Murdoch had said to John Howard, this time my newspapers cannot support you. This time we cannot make you Prime Minister. Maybe next time. This time we have to support the Labour Party.
Whenever politicians can be of use to him, Rupert Murdoch is ready to put himself out. At the European Conference of Public Television Providers, government ministers Blair and Murdoch had lunch together. A little later, they were alone together. It's a pretty safe bet that they talked about political strategy.
Mr. Murdoch, how would you describe your relationship with Tony Blair?
I'm a supporter.
He has remained faithful to Blair's war, to Bush's war, and thinks that it's so important that he's prepared to push that line through the sun, despite it not being popular.
And let me make it absolutely clear for our position as well. We stay until the job gets done.
Murdoch would be thinking more strategically about business across the world. And he believes that there is a threat if we don't have enough oil and it's not at the right price. And he's prepared to think long term, also worried about terrorism and so on, prepared to think long term, and thinks that he's willing to suffer the short term problems that come.
One more political question. Clarify your views on Hillary Clinton. I don't quite understand where you are on Hillary Clinton, nor do I.
I would just say that she's a very considerable, very intelligent lady, very calculating. I think that, unfortunately, she's a bit divisive. People think, oh my God, another 8 years of Clinton. But she has a devotee. For my part, she's way to the left of a lot of social issues, which is okay. But I'm not really frightened of her in terms of foreign policy and social things. I think, and defense. I think she'd, if anything, she might ever compensate for her image there. She would certainly, be a lot stronger and subtler and better than her husband was. I'm talking about foreign policy. Right. Defense.
And you hosted a fundraiser for her, didn't you? I think I read that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Right. So are you actually supporting her? No. For president? No. So why did you host a fundraiser?
Because some people in the office wanted to do it, and I said, fine. Let's have a breakfast. We raised. She didn't know. We couldn't imagine what it was costing so much notice.
Would you consider
friends of mine rang in horror? We raised $40,000, $50,000 for her, which is a lot less than she normally gets for a breakfast.
Would you consider supporting her?
But she was very impressive at it, I must say. Just the way she handled it, she was sidestepping them. She knew what President Bush knew, and she would have made the same decision in going in. I hope she would have run it better, that's all.
The issue of right-wing ideology versus pragmatism. In my view, he's using the Blairs and he's using the Hillary Clintons more than they're using him. Murdoch is going to last well after Tony Blair is gone. Murdoch has been coming for 20, 30, 40 years. And these politicians that he uses for 4 years or 8 years, they're a means to an end. His end is right-wing corporate neoliberalism globally. And he's serious about that. Don't make it seem like, well, he's just a pragmatist. He uses them for his political project. And the other thing that he likes about Tony Blair and Hillary Clinton is their foreign policy. They're free traders, quote unquote, neoliberals in terms of international trade, pro-war. They both supported the Iraq invasion. They're both what we call Israel right or wrong. And that's Murdoch's ideology.
Another thing we must remember about Murdoch is that he's 76, and he's not immortal. He, like everybody else, will one day die. And when he dies, possibly his media empire will be broken up. There's no great logic in this empire. He owns some papers in Australia, he owns papers in Britain, he owns a few papers in the United States, and a big television company, and many other things, of course, in China and so on. But there's no logic, particularly, other than the imperative of Murdoch's mind. Now, when he dies, who's to say whether this great empire will stay together? And it's possible that it will be broken up.
The only thing that'll stop Rupert Murdoch, because of the corrupt nature of Western capitalism today, the only thing that'll stop Rupert Murdoch is his own death.
Will Murdoch's empire be a model for the media of tomorrow, or an anti-model for future generations? The ability to lead the world's media is not a gift that lasts forever.